All right, what's up, Scott? Good to be here. Today, I wanted to take some time and talk about skill development and, in particular, like the mental aspect and the mental approach to skill development. And I think a lot of athletes, they don't fully appreciate the mental skills that can go into developing skill, your technical and your physical skills. They kind of just approach it the way that their coaches tell them, which is, hey, just show up and work hard. And that is a good rule of thumb when you're starting out is like you've got to be consistent, you've got to continue to show up to practice, and you've got to put in that work, and it's got to be hard work. But you get to a certain point where you and your peers, you and your competitors are all working hard. And working hard is no longer enough. You've got to know how to work smart, and you've got to be intentional with your work. And in sports psychology research, they call this deliberate practice. It's having a goal, it's having an intention, it's having a focus for every single training session. And when you do that, you can grow more quickly, right? You hear a lot of people talking about the 1% better. You got to get 1% better every single day. Well, you get to a point where just working hard isn't going to get you that 1% better. You've got to show up to practice with a goal and with an idea of what you're going to work on, and then stay disciplined and committed to that goal throughout the training session. So there's a lot of mental skills that go into that and how you approach it and how you organize your training. And when you take a more calculated approach to your training, you can grow more quickly and you can break through some plateaus, which tend to happen as you develop in your sport and you start to um, grow and refine your craft. So the further along you get, the more specific you have to get with your training, the more intentional you have to be, and the more organized you have to be. It's not as simple as saying, oh, I'm a basketball player, so I'm just going to go to practice and play basketball. Like that's not good enough at a certain level. If you're trying to compete in college, if you're trying to be a professional, you've got to be more intentional and deliberate about that kind of work. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about today. Some things within that are goal setting, growth mindset, and then I wanted to touch on breaking through a plateau.
Okay. So let me ask you this. So when you are trying to learn a new skill, you most of the time aren't very good at it, right? And it's very frustrating and you're trying to like learn things and you're slow and you're like, how am I ever gonna, you know, learn this and be decent at it and be able to use it in like a real situation? And so like talk about the mental aspects of taking on something new, and then like how to develop little markers or goals that kind of guide your process as opposed to like putting this lofty goal way out there and that kind of makes the process frustrating as opposed to Joel Embiid, who just got booted out of the playoffs,
Yeah.
talked about the process all the time, right? So like talk about the importance of baby steps in the process and make having little celebrating your little wins and that sort of thing.
Yeah. And before we get into goals, something that I think is really important for athletes and really anybody who's on the path to mastery. You might be an athlete, you might be a dancer, you might be a piano player. All of these things require skill development. And ultimately, what you're trying to do is you're trying to master a craft. And when you're trying to master a craft, you've got to be real with your expectations and you've got to accept that this is going to be a long process. Like this does not happen overnight. People say this all the time, Rome wasn't built in one day, but you've really got to internalize that and accept that and understand. Like if I'm trying to learn a new technique, I can't expect to learn it after being showed it one time and I go and do one rep and then I freak out because I'm like, why can't I figure this out? Well, maybe because you just got shown it a minute ago. Give yourself some time, practice it, like really put in the time and the effort, and then you can determine if you need to change your course or approach it from a different angle. But most people just get really frustrated at the beginning of the learning process because they're not comfortable with that frustration and the mistakes that you make along that process. So just having this base understanding and this acceptance of this is going to take me time and I need to be patient, right? There's the 10,000 hour rule. If you want to master anything, you have to put in 10,000 hours of experience to master it. So if you've only put in 2 hours of practice, don't expect to be a master of that skill, right? You've got to be realistic with your expectations. So I think that's the first thing, jumping off. And a lot of young kids struggle with this, maybe because they pick up a sport really quickly and they develop the basics quickly, and then they expect to develop the more advanced techniques quickly as well. But it takes time. It takes time, and that's okay. And everybody's on their own learning curve, but no matter what, it's going to take you some time. So accepting that is a huge first step. And when you do accept that and you understand, I have to be patient, I just need to keep putting in the work, I need to be intentional about my work, then you can kind of accept the days that you go in and you train and you feel like you didn't really make any progress, but really that is progress, right? Of just going in and putting in the reps. So that's the first bit. Now, in terms of goal setting, there's so much research to support the use of goals in technical and physical skill development, and it's something that all athletes should be doing. Like I mentioned before with basketball, you, you don't expect Steph Curry to go into the gym and say, okay, coach, let's get better at basketball today. Like, no, that's not how he approaches the sport. That's not how any high level athlete approaches the sport. You've got to be more specific about what you're working on. And he's not even going in and saying, all right, let me get better at my shot today, or let me get better at my dribbling today, or let me get better at my passing. No, he's even more specific than that. He's focused on one specific detail of his shot or of his passing or of his dribbling, and he's working on those fine details. So he probably creates plans and has, a focus for his practice every single time he goes in. And so with the goals, you want to have a goal for every single time you go train. Every single time you're at practice, you should have a goal, and the goal should be more specific than just, I want to get better today. That's not good enough, right? That's good enough at the beginning, when you're just picking up a sport and, you're just trying to figure out which way is up and which way is down. That's okay at that stage. But once you've got a grasp on it and you're trying to make that jump from maybe intermediate to high level to elite, you've got to start getting more and more specific with your goals on a daily basis. And if you approach each training session with a goal and with a plan, and you stay disciplined and you commit to that plan, then you will get better in that training session. You might not see specific, like measurable growth, but you'll be putting in the work, and that's what's important. So I think having goals for each practice is a must have. And then also long-term vision about your technical growth and what you want to work on, being honest about your strengths and your weaknesses, communicating with your coaches to figure out what they feel like you need to develop, using the data from your past performances. If you just went out, if you're an MMA fighter and, you just got knocked out in your last fight because you were dropping your lead hand, well, then maybe that's a technical area that you can focus on, over the course of the next 6 months. So you use your past performances to help influence what you need to develop technically. And you can approach this like you're playing Madden or you're playing 2K, where you've got all the bars and you're just trying to max everything out, and just be honest with yourself. Like if you're a soccer player, how good am I with the ball at my feet? How fast am I? How good can I kick with my right foot? How good can I kick with my left foot? How well do I communicate with others? Like, how well do I understand the theory of the game? These are all different aspects that you can look at, and you can just grade yourself on each one and get your coach's input as well and figure out long term over the course of the next 6 months, 1 year, what do I need to develop? And then you just take that and break that into smaller chunks. Okay, if 6 months from now I want to be proficient with the ball at my left foot, well, then what do I need to do 3 months from now? What about 2 months from now? What about 1 month from now? And you just break these goals into more manageable chunks, eventually getting down to the weekly goals and then the daily goals. And all of these goals should be aligned so that every day you're making progress on your ultimate big long-term goal. And if you like organize your training that way, everything is just moving in the same direction, as opposed to how most athletes approach it, where they just show up and they're like, all right, coach said I'll work hard. So, I'm going to work hard today and I'm going to try, but I don't really know which direction I'm going in. And so you kind of just end up going in circles, and that's where the plateaus happen. And that's where you can go through a whole season of your sport and then get to the end and you're like, did I even get better? Like, what was all this work for? So you get to a point where working hard is not enough. You've got to be working smart as well. And that brings you more satisfaction. When you start growing with your skill development, you feel satisfied. You can see the difference in who you are as an athlete and the skills that you have. So you start moving along this path of mastery, and that feels really rewarding, right? And that increases your motivation and your confidence and your optimism. And then you start buying into this idea of like, man, every month I level up. I turn into a better athlete, a better version of myself every month, every week. So how good am I going to be a year from now or 2 years from now? There's really no limit to how good I can be when you maintain this growth mindset, which we'll talk about later, and you buy into setting goals and staying committed to those goals. So really it's just taking that next step and being more intentional about your planning and your organizing from a skill development standpoint.
I want to relate this back to a previous topic that we've done on here, and that's like being present. And you were kind of touching on it, I think, but like, anybody who's been to a practice of any kind, whether it's sports or music or, whatever it is, you're there and you're standing in line, to get into the drill or whatever it is, and, your mind's wandering and you're not present. Like, talk about the results of being present, and maybe when you're waiting, you're thinking about what you're about to do, or maybe you can use it in a when you're competing, and that sort of thing. And just talk a little bit about the importance again of being present, and even in training.
Yeah, I can't overstate how important this is. It's incredibly important in my opinion. Like I've said before, mindfulness, or the ability to be present, is the most important mental skill that you can develop as an athlete, and in my opinion, as a person. Uh, in terms of skill development, we talked about setting goals and being intentional, and a lot of athletes will get to that point where they'll go into a training session and they have a specific goal that they're trying to work on. They've taken the time to write this down before the training session, and then they go into the training session and they just get lost mentally. And they go through the whole practice, and afterwards they're like, oh crap, I forgot about that goal, right? They didn't have that focus and that ability to keep that goal in their attention as they were going through that training session. And some of this may tie into what we talk about next, with the growth mindset and the ego and wanting to prove to others that you know what you're doing, as opposed to trying to grow and develop. But ultimately, you've got to be able to stay focused on what the task at hand is and what you set out, in terms of your intention. And, this goes for practice and skill development. You mentioned competition as well. If you have a game plan for your competition, you've got to be able to stick to that game plan. That requires presence. That requires mindfulness, right? Like Mike Tyson said, a lot of people have a plan until they get punched in the face. Well, that plan, even after you got punched in the face, may still be the right plan. So you've got to navigate the emotions that come along with that, let go of the fears and the anxieties and the nerves that may happen after getting punched in the face, and remind yourself, like, hold on, this was the plan that I came up with because I thought it was the best course of action. I thought it was the best route that I could take to get to victory. So even though it's getting uncomfortable, that doesn't mean I should veer off the plan, right? So having the ability to just see your thoughts and your emotions and navigate these things as they're popping up is imperative, if you ask me.
Yeah. I don't know how you want to jump into growth mindset, but to like something that kind of came to mind was, as you're learning a skill, as you're developing that attribute, or that skill actually, you're going to fail and you're going to lose. And you're, like I said at the beginning, you're going to be bad at it. And like you mentioned ego, talk about, the relationship between a growth mindset and your ego, and how you kind of have to push that ego aside as you're growing.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the opposite of growth mindset is fixed mindset. And the ego is a huge hallmark of the fixed mindset, right? When you're in the fixed mindset, you're not actually concerned with growing. You're concerned with showing everybody at practice that you're better than them. So you're competing in practice. And there's a time for that, right? There are live situations where it's important to compete in practice. You practice with live reps so that you get more comfortable with that intensity and the pace and the pressure of competition. That's good. But if you're competing the whole time, every second of every training session, well, what you're not doing ever is growing and learning. And so you get stuck in this fixed mindset. And when you're in this mindset, typically in training, you don't want to try new skills. You don't want to veer off and do things that, maybe aren't part of your A game, but they're part of your B game or your C game, and you're developing these skills, but you don't try them in live situations because you're worried you're going to lose. And so you just stick to what you know is going to work. And you just stick to the things that you know. And if I know what to do to beat you, well, I'm just going to keep going to that well over and over again because I want to beat you, right? When you're in growth mindset, you tend to do the opposite. You tend to make practices more challenging for yourself. You tend to be comfortable failing and making mistakes and losing in practice because you understand that that's all necessary ingredients for the growth process, right? And so if you're interested, if any listeners out there are interested in learning more about growth mindset, the woman who coined the term, her name is Carol Dweck. She's a psychologist, and she came up with this term and wrote a book on it, has done a lot of research on this. And it's incredible, the results of the research and how promising they are with students, with athletes, with anybody who's, like I said, on this path of mastery, trying to develop a skill and hone their craft. And when you can adopt this growth mindset, basically understanding that growth comes from hard work. And if you're willing to put in the hard work, if you're willing to accept constructive criticism, if you're willing to make mistakes in practice while you're learning, then you are going to grow more quickly. But if you're too wrapped up in your ego, if you're too concerned with trying to prove to other people that you know that you know it all already, as opposed to humbling yourself and going into a situation and saying, hey, I don't know what I'm doing. Can y'all help me? Can you teach me this? Like asking questions to your coach, as opposed to the coach going, hey, anybody have any questions? No, coach, we're good. I got it all. It's like, do you though? You don't have any questions? Isn't there anything that you can ask? And just coming at it from that approach and really trying to grow as much as possible. Of course, helps you to grow. So it's the attitude that you approach these situations.
Yeah, there's a guy hanging in the air behind you, and I think he was like the first story that the author that you mentioned, Carol Dweck, described in that book, where the famous story of him getting cut from his JV basketball team or whatever it was, and he still holds that grudge a little bit, but it just inspired him working his tail off so that he could, get to where he was the greatest of all time. I mean,
Yeah, and there's another story like that in his career where after making the playoffs numerous times and getting stopped before making it to the finals, um, he had to have a realization with himself, and he had to humble himself and say, look, I'm just not strong enough. I get to the paint and I just get bullied around by these big guys. So what I need to do is I need to humble myself, accept my weaknesses, and grow. And that's what he did that summer. He dedicated his summer to growing himself physically, and he got bigger, he got stronger, and then he used that to go on to win 6, NBA titles. So, yeah, it would have been easy for him to say, "Oh no, I'm good. I got it figured out." He was already the best player in the league at that point. It would have been easy for him to stay in a fixed mindset and say, "It's not me. I'm not the problem. It's my teammates. They got to figure their stuff out. I'm good enough. Look around. Look at the numbers. I'm the best in the league." But he didn't say that. He said, "No, I can get better. I can grow. There's this area that I'm not strong enough in, and I want to grow in that area." And when you look at the best athletes in the world, they all have this same trait, this ability to constantly evolve, constantly develop. And you see these guys and you're like, later in their career and they're still getting better. You're like, how is this guy still getting better? Well, it's the growth mindset. Look at LeBron. I mean, the guy's been in the NBA almost as long as I've been alive, and he's still developing. He's still adding new things to his game. It's mind blowing. But when you have that growth mindset, you can keep growing. Like there's really no limit to how much you can learn. And once you've learned it all, then you can create new things. And you see that a lot in younger sports like, mixed martial arts and jiu-jitsu, where, there are people out there who are creating new moves. They're so addicted to growing and developing their craft that they feel like they've learned everything they can, so now they're creating. How beautiful is that? That you can take your craft and then take it a next step, to like the artistry in it.
It's remarkable when that starts to happen. It's interesting. Like I remember watching Jordan's career, and he was driving the paint a lot, and then like you're right. I mean, he developed the skill to shoot from basically anywhere. Not anywhere in today's standards, but he developed a mid-range shot, a three-pointer, and he didn't have that early in his career, and so like that didn't just happen magically, right? He made the decision, he set his goals, he worked on the things he needed to work on to make that so that he'd be successful doing that. So yeah, it's interesting, like from a psychological standpoint, how do you overcome that first training session, those first 20 training sessions where you really suck, and you just feel like there's no freaking way I'm ever going to get good at this, to how do you get through that to where now all of a sudden you're really good at it? Like, how do you boost yourself along the way? Trust the process.
Trust the process, right?
Right.
And ultimately it's consistency, right? Because if you can do it for long enough, the 10,000 hours, if you can do it for long enough, you will develop the technique. Now, what gets most people is they don't do it long enough. They do it until they, feel the resistance or enough resistance, and then they bow out and they say, I can't do this anymore. It's pointless. What's the point? Um, so I think going into it with, like I said before, realistic expectations and accepting that this is a process. This is going to take time. This doesn't happen overnight. If you're trying to develop a new technique, if you're trying to like reinvent yourself even, and you see this a lot with high level athletes where they've gotten to a really high level, but now they're realizing, oh no, this technique that got me here isn't good enough. I've got to change my shot. Or golfer, I've got to change my swing. They may have been swinging the same way for 15 years, and now they have to change that technique. So that takes a lot of work. That takes a lot of practice, and that can be really scary, right? But it's accepting and understanding that this is going to take a long time. So I think that's huge, right? Having that understanding when you go into it, and then having the patience to continue to put the work in time after time after time, and when you're not going to see results, right? And there's a story about bamboo and how bamboo is grown. And I've never fact checked this to know that this is true or not, but it's a good story, even if it's not real. But apparently, you plant the bamboo and you water it every day, and you don't see anything. No shoots are coming out of the ground, no nothing. Every day, and you water it day after day, and you have to be consistent, very finicky, right? So you just keep putting the work in every single day. 5 years goes by, and you don't see any growth at all. And then all of a sudden, in a couple months, it shoots up 50 feet. And that's how the learning curve is, right? When you're going along the learning curve, you're just kind of staying steady and you're not seeing much growth at all. But then all of a sudden, you hit that curve, and then it shoots up. And you can see this represented in any kind of skill development. One of the most common that you can look at is like how toddlers learn to talk. At first they don't know any words, and then they slowly start learning words, and then they just hit this huge growth spurt in terms of
Right.
their ability to speak, right? And it's the same with anybody and any skill, right? We have to, there's that first period where it's like I said before, we don't even know which way is up and which way is down. It's so foreign to us. The concepts are so weird and so different that you're not just going to learn it like that, right? So it takes time. But then once you get your footing and you start understanding and developing the terminology and your body gets used to certain movements, then you can really grow and grow quickly. So I think understanding the whole learning process, understanding that it takes time, that you have to be patient, and that it will click, right? And part of
Yeah.
that patience is just accepting that things unfold in their own time. You might develop one technique in a week, and another technique, it might take you a month to learn. A different technique, it might take you a year to learn, right? They might all be the same skill level in terms of like how difficult they are to execute, but these things just take their own time, right? And we're all different. So understanding that, being patient, and then also being optimistic. Like you've got to maintain hope that it will click, because it will. And once you lose hope and you feel like there's no light at the end of the tunnel, that's when people turn around and they get out. And there's this concept I love, 3 feet from gold, where you're digging, and people would do this back in the gold mine, and the gold rush era. They'd be digging and they'd be digging and they wouldn't find anything, nothing. And they just keep digging and they can't find anything. And then eventually they just quit. And they're like, nah, I guess there's no gold here. Let me bail. But they didn't realize the goal was right there. They were 3 feet away from it. And had they just kept going, they would have struck gold. And that's what you have to do sometimes when you're developing technique. Even if you don't see the results, if you trust in your process, if you trust in your coaches, and you feel like they're leading you down the right path, all you have to do is stay consistent and commit to that process, and eventually you will strike the gold. But if you turn around before you get there, you don't even realize how close you were, right? So I think that has to do with the optimism and just maintaining that hope that, hey, if I just keep going, if I keep digging, like eventually I will break through. The light bulb will come on. It'll all click one night, and it'll be like, oh, finally, like, yes, I know how to do this now. It finally makes sense. Now you're all in big, big trouble, right? So I think that's important, right? And then ultimately what kind of ties all of this together is your ability to be resilient. And I think the patience and the optimism and the acceptance all allow for you to be more resilient. But there's going to be frustrations. The path to mastery is not a straight line to the top. There are setbacks, there are failures, there are days when you go to training and you feel like not only did you not get better, but you might have got worse that day. And it just feels like that sometimes. And that's okay. You've got to understand that, and that's part of the process, and be able to pick yourself back up, be compassionate to yourself, and say, hey, it wasn't the best day, but we're going to be okay. Tomorrow's going to be a better day. Let's get up. Let's keep moving forward. And like I said, the optimism helps a lot with that, the patience, and all that. So really breaking through a plateau, there is no secret formula. There's no do this and you'll be fine. It's ultimately it's going to be a grind. If you want to be a master at something, like it's not easy. It takes a lot of time. It takes patience. It takes optimism. It takes resilience. But there's a book that I think illustrates this whole path to mastery really, really well, and it's a great book. It's called Chop Wood, Carry Water. And this book it's been floated around in a lot of NFL locker rooms, and I've recommended it to some of the clients that I work with, and they've all given me a lot of really positive feedback. I think the book is amazing too, and basically it talks about a lot of these different things: plateaus, failure, growth mindset, goal setting, and ultimately it's all about skill development. The main character is trying to become a master in archery, and it kind of follows him throughout his journey and the ups and the downs that go along with it. But the title of the book, Chop Wood and Carry Water, that's that consistent work. And if you're willing to be consistent, just put that work in, day out. If you do it long enough, mastery at some point.
Yeah. It's super important to remember. The thing that comes to mind though is like you start down this path because you have like a passion or a love for what you're doing. And what danger do you run in like just this like being resilient and I'm trying to think of how to ask the question. Like when does it stop being fun for some people, or how do you like mentally get yourself to the point where this being resilient and just being patient and consistent is fun for you? That you like the achievement isn't what's so important anymore. It's the day to day part that is fun. Does that make
Right.
sense?
Yeah, it does. And it's really challenging. And a lot of athletes, have different things that bring them enjoyment.
Mm-hmm.
Some athletes really, really struggle with training and practicing, and they have a hard time finding any fun things in that, and they strictly find enjoyment from the competition part. Other athletes are the opposite, where they love training and they love just working hard and getting a sweat and developing and things like that. But uh, ultimately, I think if you can bring more fun to the training environment, and there's a lot of ways that you can do that, but if you can do that and bring more enthusiasm to it as well, because there may be certain skills that you're like super excited to work on. These are the fun skills, the flashy skills. I'm learning a new dunk or an alley oop or whatever it is, and it's like, yeah, of course I want to work on that. I'll spend all night on that. That's fun. But what about just dribbling, or being in good base, or some of the more boring skills? It's hard to be excited about those, but ultimately, I think that's attitude. And if you can bring an excited attitude and an enthusiastic attitude to some of the more mundane aspects of training, then you can find the fun in those, as well as creating fun drills for yourself. There are some really boring techniques that actually have really fun ways to drill them. So I think that's an interesting thing for coaches and athletes to look at, is like, how can I make this technique that everybody hates working on? How can I make it more exciting for them to drill and to rep out? Because there's no shortcut around that. If you want to develop it, you have to drill it. You have to do the reps, and there's no secret formula around that. So ultimately, it's like getting your kid to eat vegetables. Like, how do we do this, with the boring stuff? How do we make it a little more exciting? How do we wrap it up into something that can be more fun? So you could do that for yourself as an athlete. Coaches can do that for their athletes. Um, but ultimately, I think even if the coach isn't doing that, and it is just boring work, the athlete can still approach that with an enthusiastic attitude, and they might find enjoyment out of knowing that they're grinding, and that this is kind of the idea of embracing the grind. That like, I just love putting in the work. You can trick yourself into thinking like, I love doing the boring stuff. And I used to work for this ACT and SAT test prep company, and they used to have this technique that they would teach the students on the reading passages, because these reading passages are like notoriously boring, and they're designed to like bore the students and get them to not want to read it. And so the technique that we would teach kids we would call it first date. And so pretend like, as you're reading this passage, you're on a first date with somebody. And, when you're on a first date, they're telling you all this stuff about themselves, and you're like, oh my God, no way. That's so interesting. I can't believe, your boss did this to you, or, that, this person stole your parking spot right before you were going to park. That's crazy. Like, you're kind of faking interest, because you want to, make a good first impression or whatever. And so you can bring that same energy to skill development with really, really boring things. Like, coach tells you y'all are gonna, just stand in your stance for 30 minutes, and you're like, what? No way, we get to stand in our stance. This is awesome. I love this stuff. And you kind of like, it's a bit of fake it till you make it, but it can be a funny approach, and sometimes it can actually work into getting you excited about some boring things.
Cool.
Hmm.
What else? We missing anything on this one?
Um, I mean, I do think that the bit about fun is important. Um, and if you can incorporate that into your training sessions, fun and enthusiasm and joy, if you can bring that to your training sessions, I think that's huge, and that can help you to avoid burnout and to just be more sustainable and consistent. But at the end of the day, you've got to also lean on your discipline and remind yourself that, hey, sometimes it's not going to be fun. Sometimes I'm not going to enjoy the work, but I still got to do what I got to do. It's like being a parent. You might not always want to change the kid's diaper, but you have to. Like, you have to. And that's the same thing along the journey of mastery. Sometimes you just have to do what you have to do. And, uh, accepting that and understanding that and being willing to do the work, with a semi decent attitude, um, is important, So try to bring fun to it. If you can't bring fun to it, then, accept that the work's got to get done and get the work
Yeah. Well said.
done.
And go out and get chop wood, carry water.
Yeah, amazing book and research. Carol Dweck, her book is called Mindset, and yeah, those are two amazing book recommendations. Very, very powerful books.
Very cool. All right. You good?
We're good. Thank you, Scott.
Thank
Hopefully
you.
this stuff helps y'all and on your journey of mastery and skill development. And if you need anything, reach out.
Absolutely. It's helping me. So,
Cool.
it's good for me. All right. Hold
Mm-hmm.
on. Another good one.
Boom, boom.